All right, so give me a moment here. Okay, so those of you who've been watching what the think tank has been up to, quick question came out, registered for sessions. Will there be access to presentations? Absolutely, don't write any notes. All of the PowerPoints from all of our presentations are going to be available to you. So I want to talk specifically, our group focused on the reimagining of the built environment in public libraries. So we've had think tank groups that have covered a wide range of topics. Our group was really saying, how are we going to need to change our built environment, so our spaces, in order to continue to serve the public. And I'll start for about the first 20 minutes. I'll give you some highlights of the work that we've done as part of the think tank. And here we go. And I'm going to introduce you to. So you'll see some other faces. So I think every working group has said they've loved the people they've worked with. I have to say this has been just a fabulous team to work with. So we're really spanning coast to coast. We've got Rosemary from Vancouver Island Regional Library, Lisa from Calgary, a couple of my colleagues, Terry, who does facilities and finance, and Amanda, who does service design at Halifax Public Libraries. And we really dug in and started to explore and figure out what our best practices were. So just as a bit of background, you may have heard this if you've been at you've been on any of the other calls. These toolkits were not designed to be formal documents that are rules to follow. So we knew the time was tight. We knew as a community we needed to figure out how we would begin with this. But the truth is, the science and the practice of responding to COVID-19 is changing on an ongoing basis. And in fact, before we started this presentation, we were chatting together as a team and realized, so many things have even happened since the time we created this. So this is really about building confidence within the library sector. It is about not necessarily finding the right answer, because that's going to look different for everyone. It's really, asking the right questions. And we wanted this to be practical, and we wanted it to be timely. So health and safety, there were a whole bunch of guiding principles. They're everything from health and safety to reminding us about the inherent role that libraries play in our community. And I would argue we are more important to our community in times of crisis and in times of transition. So this was really about saying, whatever we decide and whatever we move toward in these toolkits is really about being our best for our community and really promoting the value of public libraries. So just reminding everyone, and this, every province is different. You have different building codes. We've got different requirements. The answers will be different if you're in a library space that's within a leased facility or within a shared building. So take this for the good intention that we've intended. We've done our very best where there's been an idea to attribute it properly. If you pull out pieces of this for your own staff or your own board, attribute it back to CULC, but also look at it in the context of your own legislation. All right, so built environment in particular, just so everyone knows sort of where the edges of what we were looking at were. It's everything from capacity and layout, building systems, furniture, what technology can we do to improve health and safety? And then it's really about how do we handle both staff and the public moving through and interacting within the space. So we had a whole bunch of key considerations, and we're committed to keeping our toolkit to 8 pages. So we really cut it down. But at the heart of it, it was, how do you figure out the capacity and the layout that's going to work to keep people safe? How much latitude do you have in terms of the things that you can change? Are there areas of the library that should be high priority? And, what are the things that we would never have been on our considerations list previously, but might be now? So quarantining materials was one example of that. When we talk about building systems, we talk about airflow. We talk about, are AMH machines preferable or not to staff handling? What changes might you need to make, whether that's whether that's you know, a third party that monitors some of your systems and your air quality, or it could be as simple as cleaning contracts and other things. So furniture and finishes, we really wanted to know how long, you know, what surfaces and finishes are best. If you have to buy different furniture, you have to try to recover some of your chairs, what's your best option? And then when we think about how people use our space and our furniture in particular, what are the aspects of that furniture that we want to be most concerned about? And are there ways that we can reduce the touch? So it's everything from faucets, self-checks, you name it. And then again, we had the you know, new furnishings and things you'll need for other purposes. So we talked about moving through and interacting in space. That's everything from number and position of people, pathways through buildings, entrances, exits, elevators, stairs, emergency evacuation. You know, it's one of the things that came up in this that we found really interesting. How do you evacuate or shelter in place if you're trying to keep people apart? Children's areas, staff areas, stacks, should you let people in, should you not, food, hand washing, so many questions about how we function within the space, and certainly thinking about communities. So vulnerable people, ways to work outside our regular spaces. So with all of these issues, we realized it wasn't like the library was closed and then we threw open the doors. We really saw 4 phases emerging in the reopening of the library space. And it really would begin with staff only, followed by what many of our libraries are doing right now. So staff in the building, but doing curbside pickup and some distribution out. And then really phase 3 is maybe limited public interaction and materials both being returned and distributed. And then the final one is sort of staff with full public access. And by that I say, you know, the public being allowed to what would normally be viewed as the public areas of the building. So we're going to start with capacity and layout. Certainly some things emerged here. You know, occupancy load is important, and I'm going over this in a very glossy way, but lots of resources, certainly more details in our written report and other resources that we can connect you to. Occupancy load is really an important measure, but in fact, it's not the end measure. So when you're figuring out the social distancing guidelines applied to a public space, you really need to look at the physical layout of that space. So it's everything from where are there pillars in the building that limit, you know, pathways for people? Are there going to be particular points in the space where people get clogged up, so to speak, in their movement through the building? How much furniture and equipment should you move? And, you know, do you move it to a space within the library, or do you try to find a way to get it out of there altogether? And I think if there's a one piece to take away from this is to really think about, as you map out your space design, don't think of it as a finished product. The best thing we can do going forward is to watch, you know, we can imagine these things and write them down on paper, but in fact, it's when we begin to let people in and we watch the movements that we're going to realize, oh, we imagined it would work this way, or check the social cues, watch how people are using the space, and be prepared to adjust your layout and potentially adjust your capacity. On the building system, several things emerged. One of the great pieces that you know, came out, and I think this has certainly been verified since, is that this COVID-19 is not like Legionnaire's disease. So there isn't a high level of concern at the moment with respect to air quality and worrying that it's going to live in our air handling systems. But what we do know, and what again has been coming out clearer over the last few weeks, is that the fresher the air and the better the air exchange and the airflow, the healthier we will be. So certainly outdoor has been well identified as safer than indoor, but if you are going to be in an indoor space, open those windows, run that ventilation system well beyond the open hours of the library, work with the people who monitor your ventilation system, see if you can increase the percentage of outside air, replace the air filters, keep the air moving is the most important thing to think about with respect to the building systems. Moving on to furniture and finishes. So really our best information on this topic came from healthcare. So healthcare has been building furniture or has been having furniture designed for healthcare that has really been about minimizing the spread of disease. So antimicrobial protection, fluid barriers, stain resistance. Some of that is about, you know, the virus drops. And so from a surface perspective, it's really the ability to clean that surface easily and often is really where we're going on this. So generally hard non-porous surfaces are easier in that respect than soft and porous. So certainly, you know, a vinyl chair over a fabric chair, lots of great examples. A number of the furniture companies, including Hayworth and a few others, have done some really good information on this. So we've got some information in the resources, and we'll get to that in a little bit. In terms of cleaning, it's really think about where the hands are going to go. So the chair arms, the chair backs, the study table surfaces. Now, when we wrote our guidelines, we talked about affixing a notice to encourage people to clean. Really interesting stories now coming out of Germany. When we wrote this, we didn't have any sort of experiences from the field because not very many public libraries had opened when we were writing this. But in the time since, there was an interesting presentation today through a Bibliotheca webinar from some German libraries, and they're really mobilizing the public to be partners in the cleaning. So have cleaning products available, encourage people in their own interest of their own good health to clean it before they sit down and clean it when they get up, and work to create that kind of culture. So we talk about cleaning. Really, we looked at the phase 1 and 2, we felt had a particular approach, and then phase 3 and 4, when the public's in the mix, had a bit of a different approach. Really, the easy access to hand washing with soap and paper towel is the absolute priority. In the absence of that, you know, there's hand sanitizer works as well. We had a really interesting meeting in Nova Scotia this week with our public, Dr. Strang, who's our public health officer, and he said, if you could get people when they walk in to wash their hands really, really well, then you stop worrying so much about what they touched. So clean your hands well, don't touch your face. You've reduced the risk profoundly. And I think what's been interesting to us is as the conversation has progressed over the last few weeks, we've gone from worrying a lot about quarantine, which is still an issue with respect to some materials, but we've actually focused on let's just roll back our panic about that and say, what behaviors can we create? So that easy access to hand washing at the entrance, often many places through your building, that's going to be key. And then really the cleaning of high touch surfaces, and you want something that cleans and disinfects. And then number 4 is really about that culture. So create the cleaning procedures and then make sure it's followed. So an interesting article, and I'll add this to the online links later, I read an interesting article from the Harvard Business Review about creating that culture. And it's a little bit like a global workplace safety culture of how do we respectfully remind each other if we notice that somebody's not following it. So how do we in that moment have the voice, even if it's the boss and you're shelving materials, but you notice that I didn't wash my hands? How do we make sure we create a culture where people can express that to each other? So that's the cultural part of cleaning. Now, when the public comes in, you need optimal locations for additional hygiene stations. Really remove the clutter. So magazines, things laying around, bookmarks that people can grab, not great. So removing clutter allows us to really focus in on efficiently clean. And then really do that interesting review. So what is the path that people take? Pretend you're a super spy and just follow the movement pattern and look at how many times people are touching things and what are they reaching for and what are they touching, and that will inform the best cleaning practices once the public is in the space. Generally speaking, outdoor areas should be clean, but in the outdoor space, we don't worry so much about disinfecting the way we do in the indoor space. So technology has some solutions for us here, and I understand, you know, the answers are going to be different for every library, and not every library system has the resources to automate things to reduce the risk by using technology, and not everyone has the infrastructure to support it. But we throw a couple of ideas out there. So automated material handling machines, they reduce touch, they're a good thing. retrofitting doors to open automatically and making sure that they work properly. And then look at hand sanitizer dispensers, taps, toilets. Anything where you stop many people touching the same spot is great. And then encourage the use of self-checks or mobile checks. So there are lots of ways to configure the machines that will minimize the number of times somebody has to touch that screen to move through the transaction. So turn to your technology supplier if you need to get them to help you optimize. And then really look at tap for debit or credit. We had, this isn't so much about the physical space of the library, but look at your practices, and certainly the governance team has talked about this as well. If you can get away from using cash, you've really limited the handing back and forth of things. But understand there are people in our community who only have cash. And so maybe the most equitable thing is to waive fines for a period of time. The same might be true of photocopiers and photocopier charges. It's interesting for us because when I've asked staff, what are the interactions within the library that make you most nervous? It is helping somebody with the photocopier, understanding how they pay, how that allows them to release a print job, lots of back and forth and lots of touching that happens through that. So give those kinds of things some real thought. So moving through the space, if at all possible, the best practice is to identify how staff will enter and exit the building, and preferably, that should be separate from the public. And then really, ideally people aren't going to cross so often in the doorway, so it might be okay to enter and exit through the same entrance. But understand if you've got lots of people coming in and you've got a way to separate the entrance from the exit, go for it. Reorganize your staff workspaces to achieve the physical distancing. Really important. And in fact, in these early days when we don't have the public in the library, that should be easier to do. And then really assign specific workspaces for employees. So we've had some teams in our libraries and they each have their own workspace that is theirs. They can put their lunch down on that table. They know nobody's moving it in the fridge to reach back into the fridge to get their own. Think about those places that you can keep people safe, and then really have a firm path of travel. So lots of fun examples of ways people have created paths on the ground with stick-on decals and other things. And then really we're back to that cleaning procedure and hand washing stations. That's going to be the biggest game changer. So this is when we've got the limited public contact and the full public. So we've rolled phase 3 and 4 together. You really want your staff to be entering separate from the public. Where your public's concerned, if there's any way for you to designate an indoor and an outdoor, when we think about that 2-meter distance that we're supposed to keep from each other, pretty impossible in a vestibule. Now passing by, passing each other by isn't so dangerous, but if they end up standing and talking, that's problematic. There are some really interesting contact tracing apps that can be used. There are lots of privacy issues with them as well. So we put it out there as something to explore and see how that works within your jurisdiction, and if it's something that your municipality might be using more broadly. And then really the cleaning procedures and the hand washing, sanitizing. I'm going to come back to those again and again. I saw a really nice comment for somebody who said they've decided, they will waive, it looks like they'll waive or put debit on the account for later rather than cash in the moment. Excellent. Yeah, adding printing to the ILS accounts. Great options. Again, it's not handling the coins, not needing to instruct too much. Simplifying processes saves a lot of that close contact. So other things, you want to monitor the space in your library and think about the type of occupants you're going to have. So this is now when we have public back in. One of the great examples was if your teen area is relatively small, but you know that there's a peak period in the day, are there ways for you to claim other public spaces and designate them for the teens so that they can be in the library, but you can still meet their space requirements? Really look at elevators are a problem. There are some interesting pictures on a couple of the links on our resources page that show you can create behavior where people come in, they've got their designated corner of the elevator and they face away from everybody else. You may really need an elevator attendant. This is going to be a real crunch point for libraries that have elevators. You can promote the use of stairs, but you're going to need some signage on how to safely pass each other, or wait till somebody's come down before you head up. These are going to be those clog points in your facilities. And then really think about the way we move in the space relative to emergency evacuation. So if it's determined that somebody is ill, do you evacuate under those circumstances? What if there's an emergency event, or you know, some public emergency that's happening and you have to shelter people in place? Think about, this is going to change all of those things. So unwrap all those old policies and take a look at them through a COVID lens, and then make use of your outdoor space. So even in the time since we wrote this, outdoor spaces, and really for the foreseeable few months, may be our best option for gathering our community together and minimizing the risk to people's health. Oh, I got an extra slide in there. So stacks. Really think stacks should be accessible in a single direction, primarily if you're going to provide access. You want to reconfigure service desks for fewer staff. So think about the reasons why people need to do close transactions and see if you can eliminate those, so that you don't have lineups, you don't have lots of staff lined up next to one another trying to provide service and still stay apart from each other. Try to eliminate some of the self-serve areas. So, you know, shared headphones, things that people borrow at the desk and return to the desk. Are there ways for us to sort of get out of that business of handing out small things that require a lot of back and forth? Really have a look at that. And then meeting rooms, you're really going to need to reduce capacity and maybe limit public gathering. Those are spaces that we've identified are really challenging to monitor in terms of whether people are meeting the requirements or not. So, and then where face-to-faces require, really, if you really truly need to be face-to-face, you know, plexiglass barriers, there are ways to reduce the likelihood of the spread. So garbage receptacles. You really don't want to be handling anybody's garbage, because that might be the napkin that they coughed into. So really, lots of garbage cans. Encourage people to dispose of their own garbage. Food and drink is in itself not problematic, but you might want to build in some good practices, encouraging people, if they did bring an apple with them, to wash it off. And water filling stations was another area that we looked at, and they're considered safe, but the advice was, if you've got somebody who's going to fill a water bottle, have them let the water run for 10 seconds, and then whatever needs to be flushed out will be flushed out, but beyond that, water should be safe. And then really, you may want to think about special hours for vulnerable populations. We've seen this in the retail sector. Seniors come in for the first hour of opening in grocery stores. The deep cleaning has happened overnight. And if we really want, you know, and that air handling unit's been cleaning the air all night, that would be the hour for people to come in if there's people who would like to use the library and are nervous about using it. So that's something we've never talked about. We've always thought about everybody's invited at all times. So worth discussing and seeing if that fits in your context. And then the other option is really extending hours. So where you have lower capacity, can we extend the hours that allow us to you know, continue to meet the community's need? You may be able to stretch staffing across those longer hours, because you're not going to have the volume of people in the library, and there are going to be things that you used to do that you're not doing. So give some thought to that as well. I'm seeing lots of people check in on the chat saying they've canceled meeting rooms, they've waived fines. You're on a lot of this, which is really great to see. So a couple of specific interesting things around children's areas. So we thought about the children's areas as being relevant in phase 3 and 4. So phase 3 is the public is in the building with limited access. So really, if this is people coming in maybe to grab holds off a hold shelf, to grab something to check out, probably don't want to create the environment where people are going to be hanging out for long periods of time. So really removing toys, limiting access to play structures, arranging some seats if people are coming to grab books, but generally pretty not too interactive at this point. I think anybody who's worked in a children's department knows every surface is high touch. So keep that in mind, particularly if you have cleaners coming in, that they understand that this area has a different type of behavior that happens in it maybe than other areas. Certainly the focus would be online. And the idea of loose books being gathered and then have a return procedure for those that isn't necessarily sticking them right back on the shelf. Now, once it's full access, now we've got kids in the library. Some of the advice we got around here was you could allow access to toys. So watch your local guidelines in your schools. Somebody asked, what did we consider loose books? Those might be loose books that get pulled off a shelf and end up scattered all over the floor. You might want to just take those aside. And this is true of adult books as well. Take those aside rather than sliding them back in. If you want to sort of have those sit till tomorrow or the day after tomorrow and then put them back, just because they may have been licked along the way, right? I think it's important to realize there's lots of tactile activity on the part of kids. This was a great suggestion. Think about toys for individual play. So it's not so much that you have a big pile of Lego out that 10 or 20 kids will gather around. Maybe have a Lego play pack and a family can borrow that and use it in the library and then bring it back to you. And then you've got the opportunity to clean it and put some other cleaning processes in place. Generally, things like Play-Doh and sand that we can't clean very well probably wouldn't be recommended for the library. And then really everything's high touch in the kids area. So I'm gonna turn to my colleagues because we all in our research stumbled upon things that really intrigued us. But among the many resources, we didn't have many library resources yet. IFLA had a few things for European libraries that were ahead of us, but we really looked broadly because of the issues we're facing in terms of our built environment and inviting the public in and having the public move through really are the same issues that the Retail Council of Canada is handling in terms of retail. It's really, Restaurants Canada has done some terrific work and they've got really good protocols and they're handling, the distribution of food and the passing of plates and other things. They've done a really terrific work. And, and then there are the building companies like Cushman & Wakeman. So we've got a whole list. Please, give some thought to people outside our sector because they've done a lot of the work that we were looking for. Technology and furniture vendors are all over this. They want us to continue to use their products. And so there's a little lead in, but I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we can go back to the conversation. And happy to speak to, your questions but I'm going to pass it over to my colleagues. So here I come. All right. So let's have a look. Who wants to start? Lisa, you were really intrigued about some things that you saw in terms of kids services. Oh, I'm going to unmute you.
There, I think I'm unmuted now. Thanks. Yep. Thanks, Osset, and hi, everybody. Yeah, there was just a couple of areas. We all did research into different areas of focus and just continuing on with the discussion about children's spaces and children's libraries. That was of particular interest. It's not something, I think it's something we're easing into, and as childcare centers and schools and children's museums open up across the country, every province has different guidelines, but we found some good resources for children's museums, and one in particular is the American Alliance of Museums. They're continually updating with playbooks, with reopening plans from different organizations, and one of them is the Children's Museum of Manhattan. They had some really, I thought, a well laid out document and some really interesting ways of looking at children's spaces. Children are going to come back to our libraries. They'll be looking for things to do. And so one of the things that was their guiding principle was the importance of children having a safe space to play, to learn, to create, connect, heal, and grow. And I thought that was really interesting terminology. So if we're not opening our children's spaces right away, it occurred to me that, slinging caution tape over them so that kids don't go in is not the best approach. So this document had some really creative ways of just making sure that children are safe, but still having that experience that they're looking for when they come into the library or the museum. Museums are opened here in Alberta earlier in phase 1, so earlier than libraries. So the Alberta Museums Association also has some really great guidelines that I thought were interesting. Every location is different, every jurisdiction is different, but they had some, they're dealing with queuing and lineups and things like that. So they have a good approach and they're looking at ways of doing that. They even had a 10 meters per person capacity, so as their best practice. So different sectors are looking at that in other ways. So I'll pass it on to another of my team members if they want to follow up.
Amanda, did you want to talk a little bit about some of your the things that jumped out to you?
Yeah, so one of the interesting things that we've been talking about quite a lot is basically making use of everything that you have available. So in particular, if you have outdoor space available, you might have some equipment that you typically use for outreach or for programming off-site, and maybe this is a good opportunity to sort of make the most of whatever outdoor spaces you already have available. We're quite lucky here at Halifax Public Libraries that we already have a couple of facilities that have outdoor libraries, but especially where the concerns around the risk of the virus spreading are so much less outdoors, we really want to make the most of that space. And I just want to speak really quickly to one of the comments that I noticed over in the chat about making aisles one way. I acknowledge that can be a really tricky thing, and this is definitely something you're going to want to look at sort of branch by branch, what traffic flow looks like through that space. And it might be that the way your community uses your space, it might not make sense to try and make the aisles one way. What might make more sense, and this is the suggestion that came through the chat as well, is to say that, if there's somebody in that particular aisle in the stacks, just wait until they're finished before you go in, so that it's, one person per aisle, depending on what sort of distance of space is there in the aisles. But that's something that, if you're really looking at a floor plan and kind of mapping out, okay, people are coming in here and they're leaving here, what makes the most sense for your space. And that's a pretty time consuming process. I know that's what we're in the middle of doing right now for HPL. But it's worth kind of mapping it out ahead of time, so you can, as best as you can, predict how people are going to be moving through your space and where those sort of bottlenecks might happen and what you can do ahead of time to alleviate them. So maybe that's, turning a program room into storage, or maybe it's moving the location of your hold so that they're kind of on people's path through the space rather than in an area that might be quite congested. So that it's important to do that work before we open up the doors to the public.
I would just add to Amanda's comments that it is a little bit about this layout of the space and sort of how you manage movement. And it's also about culture. And I think we've all in our public libraries worked really hard to create a culture of respect. And this is going to be a test of that. Somebody's in a rush and they're going to have to wait till somebody else has walked out from an aisle in order to essentially for the public to retain that ability to access those stacks. So that's going to be an interesting test for us. Certainly there are all the behavioral aspects as well about, we already have some customers trying to police other customers. Tricky setting. And these are going to be challenging months ahead. And again, some of it's layout and some of it's really how we work with our public to take on those safe practices when they come into the library. So I'm looking at a couple of the chat things. I think, Colette raises a really interesting question. How are we going to manage our patrons who come and want to stay the whole day if we have limited capacity? Really tricky question. Certainly one of the things we've talked about at our central library, we have, for example, a performance hall called Paula Regan Hall, which has been booked for programs and author readings and university classes and so many things back to back all day. And that has been very much about gathering people together. We may consider that actually that lingering space. So in the summertime in particular, where people need cooling stations, I'm not sure if there's anyone from Toronto Public on, but I think it's Toronto Public that has used a couple of branches for cooling centers, even as the library hasn't been open. So those are, you know, though it may be about sort of designating maybe lingering space and moving through space differently. Those meeting rooms aren't going to work as meeting rooms, so it might, you know, it might be possible to convert those. Oh, interesting comment from Greater Victoria Public Library as well about a lot of staff space has been converted to public space for a whole bunch of reasons over the last couple of decades in public libraries. Really good point. We've worked so much toward, you know, you don't have your own office, but you're going to just tuck into any one of these workstations. Really tricky. If you had a chance to attend the staffing session, there was some good information there. I think the best practices will also be on the website. It is different now, right? So it may be people having a laptop instead of a shared desktop together and being able to move to a place, or maybe even work from home, or maybe even work on different shifts, so that if there is exposure in the workplace, not the entire branch of the staff from all staff from a branch haven't been exposed because you've worked in 2 separate shifts. So none of this works independent of everything else. So Terry, did you want to talk about what jumped out to you? What was your favorite find over the course of our research?
Well, I think one of my favorite finds was about a month ago when I saw the information coming out from Hayworth on a before and after view of an office space, which was easily transformable into the ideas that would be applicable to a library space. And I think that was one of the first times the light came on for me and say, I know how to go about solving this problem. I can see some of the tools that they laid out relative to meeting space or individual space or collective space or use of computers and hoteling stations. The other thing I really liked about their information is they combined this with the issues and discussions of the culture of the organization and leadership within the organization. So they said, you know, take this as an opportunity to build your organization. So I think that was a light bulb that occurred to me. Some technical information from the American Society of Testing Materials on how droplets move through the air and fall out very quickly was very helpful, because I really like the science of it. So it explained how, you know, we do not have to worry about this particular virus. Other viruses are different, become aerosol and moving through the air and traveling 30 or 40 feet. That doesn't happen. The perimeters are quite small. The other under opportunity is that we've really taken the first few weeks to go into our facilities and do things that otherwise we would never have a chance to. So we've got some really high painting done. We've changed light fixtures. We've changed some electrical panels, all of activities that would have required in normal times shutdowns and interference of the regular public service. So look to any of your branches where you need to replace lights that are high or get scaffolding in to do some work or clean the ventilation system. This is a really opportune time to do it. And certainly in our marketplace here, it's not been an issue with getting contractors in and still applying those principles of social distancing. So those are a few things that certainly come to mind in my experience in the last 12 weeks.
So we've had some interesting comments on the chat. Some questions around code of conduct. Definitely a governance team also has sort of come up with, so there's a governance toolkit as part of this overall think tank project. They've been looking at the whole range of policies. I think there definitely is some place to revisit that code of conduct, because there are going to be reasons you may need to approach somebody in terms of maintaining safe social distance, and you want to practice that and make sure you feel confident in those conversations. Thanks for all the folks from Hamilton who chimed in to say you are the ones with the cooling centers, not Toronto. I know Toronto's been distributing food. Everyone, I just, you know, can I just say really broadly, I'm just so proud of everything our libraries are doing across this country and responding in whatever is needed in our local communities. interesting question from Rebecca about public washrooms and allowing people to use those. I think it has become very clear that the public washrooms are something we never even gave thought to. And of course, people rely on us for public washrooms and for menstrual products and for, you know, a whole bunch of basic amenities, filling up a water bottle, lots of things that they come to us for that they now have difficulty accessing. At our central library, we actually set up, because we weren't confident that we, in the processes that could have people come in and use the washroom and exit out without wanting to then also engage in other activities that weren't available yet. We actually set up, we have porta potties that are on the back plaza behind our library, and hand washing stations. So both, there's hand sanitizer in the porta potties, but there's a separate hand washing station to encourage people, even if they don't have to go to the bathroom, come by and wash their hands. But our staff have been working with, alongside that. They've been handing out snack packs. They've been connecting with people who are vulnerable in the community, really working to sort of stay connected even as our branch isn't open yet. So also another question about service desks outside of plexiglass enclosures. So that's you know, plexiglass is one of the options. I'm thinking, Lisa, you did a bit of work on this when we were working on our project together. I don't want to put you on a spot. Maybe it wasn't you.
Well, I've done a lot of thinking about it as far as I'm sure everyone else has too. You mentioned furniture companies earlier, and we've certainly been relying on, we're getting a lot of information sent to us from furniture companies that we deal with, and they're a really great resource. Of course, they want you to buy their products, but they've been doing tons of research on this. So we had one package sent to it. We did an RFI actually for different products and received that from various furniture vendors. So there's lots out there. In terms of, we're sort of right now thinking of it as a temporary. We're not installing anything that's permanent. I think you don't have to invest a lot of money in it right away. Even for staff spaces, we've seen cardboard options that you can move from space to space, and cardboard, what we're hearing anyway, is a surface that, you know, is, it's not as maybe easy to clean, although it is cleanable, but a virus would not live as long on cardboard as others. So you could quarantine it and then reuse it. So that's sort of where I've been in thinking about barriers.
Yeah, so the cardboard is an interesting one. I'm picturing that, Lisa, as sort of like a portable voting booth. Is that the look we're going for? Not great in terms of connecting with the public, but if you really want to make sure that, you know, whoever's working next to you doesn't sneeze on you, or if you have two desks facing each other, it's a good way of creating a physical barrier.
Or even for computer stations, like public PCs is a big question. How do you, there's high need for public PCs, but you can't fit as many people in those spaces now, and we tend to crowd them in there. So, you know, the cardboard partitions might be something to think about there.
Yeah, I think the thing that has also become clearer over the last few weeks is some of it's, you know, it's like the high-low in interior design. There are some really effective, low-cost solutions that may not look great, but are going to achieve it. So when we talk about hand washing stations is a really good example. You might, sure, you could install a sink and a beautiful backsplash and an auto touch, no touch faucet, or you can get, you know, one of my colleagues in Nova Scotia sent around a picture. It's almost like the camping jug with the spigot. Room temperature water is fine, and then you've got a big catch basin, and you've got soap, and you've got paper towel, and, you know, for less than $100, you've added one more hand washing station. So it is about us being practical in our responses, and understanding that you may go for the elegant solution in the long term, or you may never get there. And at the end of the day, I think our public will understand, because our commitment is to provide access to the library and to keep them safe. So Rosemary, you have lots of small libraries. You know, when you've been thinking about the space, what are the things you're giving particular thought to for small libraries?
For the smaller libraries on Vancouver Island, we're looking at capacity. I mean, we have some locations that the staff member is the only person that can actually be in the space. So we're looking at outdoor spaces, tents, those sort of things. You know, so that's a challenge. We also have a great need, as was said by Lisa, for our computer access. So we are looking at pulling out stations, but putting in not plexiglass, but a plastic environment that is temporary, so that people do feel confident in coming in and using our facilities. And I think that's something that you know, as library leadership, as library workers, as the library industry, that's what we really have to do, is provide our customers, our staff with the confidence that this is a safe environment. And you know, you look at what CULC has done, and the sharing of the information, even looking outside of our own profession. I mean, that is still fascinating to me. And you know, looking and borrowing, you know, things from the Restaurant Association of Canada, who knew, right? But I think that's the exciting part of this, is learning to reinvent your space. On the island, because we do have small communities, we reinvent our space all the time. And, you know, if I can just pass on anything, I think you said it also, was the fact that, you know, going forward, I think we have to look at library design and less touches. How do we ensure that, you know, we don't, I don't want to say they're mistakes, but how do we improve the design? How do we, you know, improve the product that we put in those washrooms? We have quite an aggressive building program, and that's what we're doing. Okay, how can we get people in and out with as less touches as possible? We also have an older demographic, and I think, you know, how do we ensure that they're welcome, they feel safe, but they get that interaction again? You know, putting 6 feet between everybody is not, you know, the easiest way to have a conversation. You're always very conscious of it, but I think as we get through this, we'll find out what does work and how we can get the confidence of our customers back and into the library.
I think you made a great point there, Rosemary. And it is that often the work we've been doing, we've been working so hard to come out from behind the desk to serve people in closer proximity, to be alongside them in their learning rather than sort of the deliverer of the one truth. I thought there was a great suggestion that Vancouver Island posted on the chat. They've got the idea of plexiglass placed on top of a book truck. And, you know, that's really interesting, right? Then you've got your book truck, you just park it where you need it to be so that you can work alongside somebody. Great idea there. Face shields, lots of questions about face shields on the chat. We've been talking about those at Halifax Public Libraries as well. We're sort of watching to get sort of the final word on where face shields align with face masks. You know, I'm somebody who has a hearing impairment, and I can tell you the masks are really problematic, because although I have hearing aids and function quite well, once people started wearing masks, I realized how much I was relying on that lip reading to confirm that I'd heard it correctly. So when we think about our solutions to these things, we also need to think about accessibility and making sure that in the course of trying to be safe, we're also being mindful about accessibility in all forms. So whether that's whether that's not rearranging our furniture, so not rearranging our furniture so that somebody in a wheelchair can't pass through. Although generally, if we're looking at social distancing, we should also actually that'll likely make all of our branches more accessible, because there will be more vacant space. And the other things are things like people with hearing impairment or visual impairment. Certainly people with visual impairment have worked really hard to master their route through our buildings. How are we going to particularly reach out to communities to, make sure that when they arrive in, we give potentially that opportunity for reorientation to our spaces before our spaces are public. So sorry guys, my texting is beeping along. I'm not sure if you can hear it, but it's a little bit distracting. So looking through here, Institute of Museums shared that BIOS transfer time was only 24 hours. Not sure what everyone else is doing. Great comment. That's been one of the things that has changed over the course of, from the first time our work group met to now. And I heard our public health officer say, really, you know, we're less concerned about that. Certainly, we started with thinking about 48 or 72 hours. You know, my advice to everyone is keep your ear to the ground. Our entire world is figuring out this virus and figuring out where when is it most dangerous and where did we think it was dangerous, and it's turned out that it's not the most dangerous practice. So that, I think, is a changing story. Quarantining is something that requires an organizational structure around it, and then it also requires space. So if you're going to start quarantining materials that are returned to the library, how are you going to track those? If you're quarantining holds before they go out, you know, that's going to require some space and some reappropriation of space within the library. So, I'm hearing Coquitlam has been doing it for 5 days. Again, don't be afraid to revisit these things as you go, as we learn more information. One of the things we've talked about with respect to quarantining materials, and I don't want to delve too far into the collection, is, you know, do you pack them and then put a note on it, say, open me 24 hours after you take me home? Now we're not holding them at the library. We're trusting that member of the public to be our partner in the interests of their good health. So we can share some of this responsibility with our public. I know we've run towards solving all the problems in the first instance because we're concerned and we care, but we can definitely work with our public on this. All right, other questions, other comments from my team members? I know we're down to the last 8 minutes of Friday afternoon. Actually, it's Friday afternoon in Halifax. It's only just barely Friday afternoon in BC.
Can I just make a comment, Osa?
Yes.
Just one thing I wanted to mention, and I know this came up in a lot of our discussions, is when possible and if possible, try and make sure your spaces continue to be welcoming places. So there are opportunities all the way along the way to welcome the public back into the space. So whether that's through the language or the visual look of your signage, keeping the tone sort of light and optimistic. Maybe you're using floor decals, but instead of big X's like don't sit here, maybe they're like, this is the place where you can sit. We invite you to sit here. So just as much as possible, we want people to continue to feel welcome in our spaces and feel safe and comfortable using them.
Yeah, that's a great point, Amanda. Go ahead, Lisa.
Sorry, just to add to that sentiment, I'm really interested in how other organizations are managing their large amounts of furniture to accommodate physical distancing. At our largest location at Central Library, just in soft seating alone, we have 400 items. So I've been thinking about, you know, how do you manage the family who comes in and wants to sit together versus the people who need to keep 6 feet apart. And I heard of a restaurant in New York City, I think, who filled half of their seats with mannequins. And maybe that's not something that we would do in the library, but I just thought it was a really creative approach to addressing that concern. And I know there will be lots of creative approaches to doing that.
No, I think that's great advice. Any other words of advice as we head to the finish line? Any more questions? All right. Oh, Rosemary, are you reaching in to say something? Oh, I will unmute you. There we go. Oh.
I was actually reaching in to put my shoe back on. No, I just wanted to, have a few sort of closing remarks, and they're on behalf of myself and my library system of being a part of this team. It's been fascinating to watch it grow, to watch it evolve. And I just want to say thanks, Osa. You've done a marvelous job here. And Lisa and Terry and Amanda, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Rosemary. It's been a lot of fun. The thing I hope comes of this, and I say this to all 220 people who are on the call, it's really, we want to build a community, a collaborative community across the country, and a community of learning and a community of sharing. And, you know, this is not the end of this story. This is the beginning of this story. So we will all learn as we go along. And, you know, let's keep sharing. Let's stay connected. If any of you have a great idea, you know, something you want us to do a webinar on as part of CULC, I sit on the CULC executive, you know, reach out to Jefferson and say, I think it's time for us to check in with each other again. Really would love to have an update on how things look now 6 months in. Please, you know, this is, we're all helping each other through this, and really glad that you've been interested. So thank you all. Thanks to my team members. You know, we've had fun. So it's been lots of fun. Last little point before we go, somebody asked about cleaning products. The Canadian government has a great, it's on our resource list, a great list of really inexpensive to make cleaning products that will meet the national standard for wiping down surfaces. And they talk about contact time, and you know, that's really how long obviously you would leave the product on the surface. Anyway, lots of great resources there at the federal level. So thanks everyone for joining us. Enjoy your weekend.